In the spring of 1942, inside a converted squash court beneath the stands of a sports stadium in Leipzig, Germany, a nuclear reactor came within a few critical steps of achieving the world's first self-sustaining chain reaction. The scientists gathered around that experiment were not Americans working under Robert Oppenheimer in the New Mexico desert. They were Germans. They were working for Adolf Hitler. And if the experiment had succeeded the way it was designed to succeed, the history of the 20th century would have been so different that the world we live in today would be unrecognizable. The experiment did not succeed, and the man most responsible for that failure was one of the most brilliant physicists in Germany, a Nobel Prize winner who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. His name was Werner Heisenberg. And for decades after the war, almost nobody knew the truth about what happened in that basement. To understand the stakes of what Heisenberg did or did not do, you have to understand how close Germany actually was. This is the part of the story that most people get wrong, because the post-war narrative, shaped largely by American triumphalism and by Heisenberg's own carefully managed public statements, insisted that the German atomic program was never really competitive. That German scientists had made fundamental errors, that they were never close. The documents that emerged from a secret British intelligence operation called Farm Hall tell a different story. In the summer of 1945, the British captured 10 of Germany's top nuclear scientists, including Heisenberg, and held them in a comfortable English country house while secretly recording every conversation they had. When the transcripts were finally declassified in 1992, they revealed something that the official history had been suppressing for nearly 50 years. The German scientists, upon learning that the Americans had successfully detonated an atomic bomb over Hiroshima, were not confused about why they had failed. Several of them were shocked that they had failed, because several of them had believed until that moment that their program had been on the right track. The German atomic weapons program, known as the Uranviren, the Uranium Club, had begun in September 1939, the same month Germany invaded Poland. Within weeks of the invasion, the German Army Ordnance Office had convened a secret conference in Berlin that gathered the most important physicists in the Reich and asked them a direct question. Could nuclear fission be used to build a weapon? The answer that came back from Werner Heisenberg and his colleagues was carefully qualified, but essentially affirmative. The physics was sound, the principle worked. The practical difficulties were enormous but not necessarily insurmountable. The project was classified at the highest level and given resources that, by the standards of German wartime science funding, were substantial. Heisenberg was appointed the program's scientific director, a position that placed him at the absolute center of Germany's most secret and most consequential weapons research. He was 38 years old, already a Nobel laureate, already recognized as one of the 2 or 3 most important theoretical physicists alive. He had developed the uncertainty principle, a fundamental contribution to quantum mechanics that had reshaped how physicists understood the behavior of matter at the subatomic level. He was, by any measure, exactly the right man to lead a nuclear weapons program, which made what he subsequently did either the most significant act of scientific sabotage in history or the most consequential series of honest mistakes ever made by a brilliant mind. The argument about which one it was has never been fully resolved, and it probably never will be. What is not disputed is the sequence of events. Between 1940 and 1942, Heisenberg and his team worked toward a critical objective: building a working nuclear reactor. A reactor was not a bomb, but a reactor was the necessary first step toward a bomb, because a working reactor would demonstrate that a sustained chain reaction was achievable and would begin producing the plutonium that could, in theory, be used in a weapon. In June of 1942, Heisenberg presented his program's progress to Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, and to a gathering of senior military and government officials. This briefing is one of the most consequential meetings in the history of the war, and it has been reconstructed from documents, memoirs, and Speer's own post-war accounts in ways that leave certain crucial questions permanently open. Speer came to that meeting prepared to offer Heisenberg essentially unlimited resources. Germany's armaments production was running at high capacity. The war in the East was going badly, but had not yet become catastrophic. If Heisenberg had told Speer in June of 1942 that Germany could have an atomic bomb within 2 years, Speer later said he would have received whatever he asked for. Instead, Heisenberg told Speer that a bomb was technically possible, but that the industrial infrastructure required to produce sufficient enriched uranium would be enormous, would take years to build, and would require resources that the German war economy could not realistically provide. While simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts, he presented the atomic program not as Germany's war-winning secret weapon, but as a long-term research project with uncertain timelines and very large resource requirements. Speer left the meeting without committing the massive resources that would have been necessary to give the German program a realistic chance of producing a weapon during the war. The program continued, but at a scale that made a wartime atomic bomb essentially impossible. Was this an honest assessment, or was it a carefully constructed understatement designed to ensure that Adolf Hitler would never get an atomic bomb? Heisenberg spent the rest of his life insisting that it was the former, that he had simply told Speer the truth as he understood it. His critics, and there were many of them, including fellow physicists who had a very different understanding of the program's potential, insisted that it was the latter, that Heisenberg had deliberately misled Germany's military leadership about what was actually achievable. The farm hall transcripts complicate both interpretations in ways that are deeply unsettling. On the night that Hiroshima was bombed, the hidden microphones recorded Heisenberg telling his colleagues that he had always assumed that the Americans would not be able to produce enough enriched uranium for a bomb during the war, because the industrial challenge was simply too enormous. He seemed genuinely surprised that they had managed it. This sounds like a man who had made an honest miscalculation, not a man who had deliberately steered his program away from success. But it could also be read as a man who had spent 3 years constructing a rationalization for decisions he had made for moral reasons, and who had lived inside that rationalization so completely that he had come to believe it himself. The sabotage interpretation gained its most dramatic support from a source that Heisenberg himself could not have anticipated. In Copenhagen, in the fall of 1941, Heisenberg had traveled to the occupied Danish capital to meet with his former mentor, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr. Bohr was the most respected physicist in Europe, a man whose opinion carried moral weight across the scientific community of both the Allied and Axis worlds. The meeting between Heisenberg and Bohr has become one of the most analyzed and contested conversations in the history of science. The subject of a celebrated play of endless historical reconstruction and of a fundamental disagreement that the two men carried to their graves. What we know is that Heisenberg said something to Bohr that evening that horrified the older man so completely that their decades-long friendship ended on the spot and was never repaired. What Heisenberg said exactly is not known. Bohr's account, written in a series of letters that he drafted but never sent, described Heisenberg as appearing to suggest that German physicists were working on atomic weapons, and that Bohr should accept this as inevitable and perhaps even assist. Heisenberg's account was completely different. He said he had been trying to ask Bohr whether physicists on both sides of the war could agree not to work on atomic weapons, a kind of informal scientific arms control. He said he had been reaching out to the one man he trusted, looking for moral guidance about what he should do. The conversation ended badly before anything was resolved, and Bohr subsequently made his way to Britain, and then to the United States, where he joined the Manhattan Project and contributed to the bomb that Heisenberg said he had been trying to prevent. The physical evidence from the German program itself is ambiguous in ways that have frustrated historians for 80 years. The reactor experiments that Heisenberg conducted used heavy water as a moderator, a technically valid approach, but one that made the program dependent on a supply of heavy water from a plant in occupied Norway, a dependency that made the entire program vulnerable to Allied sabotage. In February of 1943, a team of Norwegian resistance fighters, trained by British Special Operations, destroyed the heavy water production facility at Vimork. In one of the most celebrated commando operations of the war, this attack set the German program back significantly, and is often cited as the decisive intervention that prevented Germany from achieving a working reactor before the war's end. What is less often discussed is the question of whether the reactor design that Heisenberg was pursuing would actually have worked even with adequate heavy water supply. Post-war analysis of the German reactor designs suggests that they contained a configuration error that would have prevented a sustained chain reaction. The error was in the geometric arrangement of the uranium and heavy water components, a mistake that any competent physicist reviewing the design should have caught. Heisenberg was not any competent physicist. He was among the most competent physicists on Earth. Whether the error was a genuine mistake or a deliberate flaw inserted into the design by a man who understood the consequences of getting it right is a question that the physics alone cannot answer. What can be said with confidence is this: the German atomic bomb program failed. It failed for multiple reasons that reinforced each other: the heavy water dependency that the Norwegian saboteurs exploited, the resource constraints that Heisenberg's 1942 briefing to Speer helped create, the Allied bombing campaign that disrupted German industrial production across the board, and the fundamental design problems in the reactor experiments. Whether Heisenberg contributed to any of these failures deliberately, whether he was the man who saved the world by steering his country's most dangerous weapons program away from success, or whether he was simply a brilliant scientist who made honest mistakes and then spent the post-war decades constructing a more flattering narrative around them, is a judgment that each person who studies the evidence must make for themselves. What is not in question is the consequence: Germany did not get an atomic bomb. The United States did. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 people in 2 days, and ended the war in the Pacific. The world that emerged from those two explosions, with American nuclear dominance shaping every subsequent decade of geopolitics, was a specific world created by a specific sequence of events. Remove Heisenberg from that sequence. Give his 1942 briefing a different conclusion. Give the German program the resources that Speer was prepared to offer, and the world that emerges is something else entirely. Something that the people who lived through the 20th century can perhaps imagine dimly in their darkest moments. Something that Werner Heisenberg, whatever his true motivations, whatever the real content of that conversation in Copenhagen, whatever he actually knew and intended and chose, helped ensure did not come to pass. He died in 1976, taking the full truth of what he had done or not done with him. The uncertainty principle that he had given to physics, the idea that certain pairs of physical properties cannot both be known with precision at the same time. The more precisely you measure one, the less precisely you can know the other, turned out to apply, with a bitter irony that he appreciated more than anyone, to the man himself. The more precisely historians have examined his actions, the less certain they have become about his intentions, and the more certain they have become about his intentions, the less they have been able to precisely reconstruct what he actually did. Werner Heisenberg remains, 80 years after the war that defined him, the most uncertain man in the history of certain knowledge.